The Lord be with you. Every so often I get a request to address a particular topic in a homily. And last Sunday during our community meeting during the meeting, Lawrence Bird asked if at some stage I would address again the topic of community and community building. We had a great community meeting last Sunday. And so that's what I'm going to do in today's homily. I'm going to revisit stuff I did actually in 2014 on March the 2nd before another very important community meeting that we had. So I'm addressing the topic of community and community building and leadership this morning. So I've chosen a kind of a pastiche of readings from Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles that talk about, community and about the leadership roles. So it's both from the Gospel of Luke and from the Acts of the Apostles, also written by Luke. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. When Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out demons and to cure diseases, and he sent them out to proclaim the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. After this, the Lord appointed another 72 and sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go himself. He told them, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I am sending you out like lambs among wolves." And from the Acts of the Apostles, in those days, when the number of the disciples was increasing, the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. So the 12 gathered all the disciples together and said, "It would not be right for us to neglect the ministry of the Word of God in order to wait on tables. Brothers and sisters, choose 7 people from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them and give our attention to prayer and the ministry of the Word." This proposal pleased the whole group. They chose Stephen, a person full of faith and the Holy Spirit, also Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas from Antioch, who was a convert to Judaism. They presented these 7 people to the apostles, who prayed and laid their hands upon them. So the word of God spread. The number of the disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large group of priests also joined the young movement. A gospel inspired by God. Have you ever had a piece of good news which is so important to you that you're bursting to tell a bunch of people about it? Yeah? I'm not talking about gossip here. Yeah. I'm not even talking about a piece of good news that you're going to be able to divulge in 3 or 4 minutes of conversation. I'm talking about an understanding or an insight that's going to shift a community or shift a group of people. And you get the privilege of being the person to kind of articulate that for the first time. For me, that was one of the great privileges of working as a missionary priest in the parts of Africa I was in, that there were some communities that I became part of for whom I was their introduction to the figure called Jesus of Nazareth. It's an extraordinary privilege when you get to be the first person into a group or a tribe, and to bring a totally new cosmology or a totally new understanding. And for me, it wasn't that I was coming in with the truth and I was going to kind of sweep aside the old wisdom and implant a brand new model. It was about cross-fertilizing the old wisdom with a new form of wisdom, and to watch how communities responded and changed in the process. How their theologies changed, their cosmologies changed, community togetherness changed. So it's an extraordinary privilege to be able to go into a community and bring in something which is radically new, and see what happens. Carl Jung called this, such a person a Gnostic intermediary. And a Gnostic intermediary is very different from a crusader. A crusader comes in and tries to abolish an old system, whether it's a health model or an educational system or an agricultural model or a religious system, and implant a brand new one. As a crusader does that. The Gnostic intermediary goes in order to cross-fertilize two wisdom traditions to the mutual benefit of each other. And so Christianity benefits from its encounter with Africa, and Africa benefits from its encounter with Christianity. So for me, that was the thrill of working in very remote areas in East Africa. But there are people sitting here today in this community who've had that privilege on 2 occasions in the last 21 years. There are people here today, who I'm just watching them even at the moment, who had the privilege of introducing a totally new way of doing spirituality on 2 different occasions since 1995. In 1995, when a group of us decided that we wanted, to develop a new kind of a theology, a new kind of a cosmology, a new way of being church, a new way of self-empowerment, where everybody was equally important and all views were recognized. And we started, at that stage, the Thomas Merton Center with a different kind of liturgy, different kind of cosmology, different kind of structure of community. And that, initial kind of movement, it lasted about 2 years, and then there was a bifurcation point reached where, by a very narrow majority of about 9 votes, people decided they wanted to go back to the safety of the Catholic Church. And they went back, and at that stage we started a new organization, which is 19 years old right now. Next year we'll celebrate our 20th anniversary, God willing, and it was called Companions on the Journey. And so for the second time, we tried to create a cosmology of self-empowerment, not narcissistically, but in the sense of taking our spirituality so seriously that we took charge of our own journey. We weren't waiting for anybody else to dictate to us what we should believe and what we should think. And so we set out, we created new liturgies, we created new ways of being in community, we created new ways of making decisions, we created a whole new way of our relationship and understanding our relationship to each other, our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to nature, and our relationship to God. And so on the basis of that, I want to address the notion of community this morning, and I'm going to make 4 main points this morning. I will talk firstly about preconception contracts that you've heard me address many, many times. And then I'll talk about the stages of building community. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the history and the future of ministry. And then fourthly, some guidelines for leadership. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, it's all predicated, community is always predicated, as far as I'm concerned, on the notion of the preconception contract. We, are not human beings who've just banded together to have some kind of an ecclesiastical experience. We're spirit beings. We're eternal souls who have volunteered for incarnation, and we travel in soul pods, in cohort groups, from lifetime to lifetime. The same group of souls tend to congregate together to create a drama which affords each person the ideal opportunity of growing up and waking up in whatever way you choose. And so we're like a Shakespearean troupe. Let's say you start a Shakespearean group in your little town, and there's 40 members. And each year you put on a new drama. So you put on Hamlet one year, and Macbeth the second year, and A Midsummer's Night Dream another year. It's the same group of people, but each year as you play a different drama, you take totally different roles. You may change gender. So you change everything about you, except that you're still trying to improve your acting skills, and parenthetically, to kind of entertain an audience. The primarily is about developing your acting skills. Now we're like that little group. We move from lifetime to lifetime with each other. We may change ethnicity, we may change gender, we change relationships, we change roles. We're the same group of people creating a drama, and the object of the drama is to learn how to love unconditionally in all circumstances. And we keep testing ourselves against different kinds of configurations in order to say, if I found myself in this kind of a situation, could I love anyway? If I found myself in that situation, could I love anyway? And so the basis of all community is that there's these preconception contracts. Now, there are very different levels. They're like concentric circles. Maybe the first level of the preconception contract is the contract between soulmates. And we have a term in Gaelic which is actually better than the word soulmates. In Gaelic we call it anamachara, or the plural is anamacharda. And an anamachara in Gaelic is not necessarily a romantic relationship. In English, the term, soulmate tends to have kind of romantic connotations, and sometimes it can be that. But in Gaelic, anamachara is a deal between two souls who walk really, really closely with each other from lifetime to lifetime. And it can be a parent-child relationship, it could be a sibling relationship, it could be a romantic relationship, it could be a collegial relationship, but there's this bondedness. And you see great instances of this throughout human history. I think, for instance, that Jesus of Nazareth and Mary of Magdala were these kinds of twin souls. That he came to bring Christ consciousness, and she came to bring what I call Christa consciousness into the world. I see the same thing with, say, Francis of Assisi and St. Clare, who founded the Poor Clares. I see the same thing between, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And so is this extraordinary bond. A very famous Irish saint, St. Bridget, said one time that a person without an anamachara is like a body without a head. So you're not completed. And so that's the first level of contract. Now, I don't think that we're not lucky enough every single lifetime to bring that anamachara into our life right then, but basically they travel from lifetime to lifetime with each other. That's the first level of the contract. The second level would be the family grouping. That's an extended version of the contract. The next level out might be the clan, then the tribe, then the nation, then all human beings on the planet, then all sentient beings everywhere in the universe. We're all bonded. We're all in contract with each other. And we're all coming down to learn this kind of thing. And it's always about waking ourselves up. The entire object of incarnation is to realize that the entire experiment is a single safari that started in God's womb and ends in God's heart. But God doesn't mind how many, diversions we take or how long it takes us to realize that. He knows and she knows that we were created in love for love, and that when we learn to love unconditionally, the journey is completed. But no matter how many, diversions and distractions and detours we may take, God just sits back and says, okay, it's your gig, guys. You take as long as you need and take as many detours as you want. But ultimately, I know where you started and I know where you're going to finish up. Now, so incarnation and mission is always about trying to align with that purpose as easily and as quickly and as we can. And so waking up, this is what all the great avatars tell us. The Buddha calls himself the Buddha, which means I am awake. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. Jesus says again and again and again, if the householder knew at what stage the thief was going to break in and steal, he'd stay awake. So it's about being awake. Awake to what? Awake to the realization of who you really are, that you're a bite-sized piece of God, having a human experience. Awake to the fact of who your neighbor is. Your neighbor is every created thing. Every created thing is simply another articulation of the divine. It's recognizing, being able to say to everything that exists, the flower in your garden, the robin in your tree, the puppy dog that's licking your hand, or your neighbor over the fence, namaste. The divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And then trying to wake up the world itself to that kind of a consciousness, to bring Christ consciousness into our international affairs and into our dealings with each other. So these are the levels of contract. And all community is predicated on that understanding. It is very difficult to create meaningful community unless we have this eternal realization of what the origins and the purpose of community might be. So that's my first point. Secondly, then I want to look at what then are some of the stages of community building. And I want to give a few different examples because community comes in a variety of flavors. And so when you look, for instance, at the relationship of lovers, people who are romantically involved with each other, such a relationship will go inevitably through 4 distinct stages. The first stage is always infatuation. You fall in love with somebody and the sun and the moon and the stars shine out of your beloved. Very easy to say in relationship then. The second stage is intimacy, where we begin to share our dreams, our bodies, our finances, our living arrangements, our hopes for the future. And again, it's very easy to stay connected during the second stage. The third stage always comes in relationship, and it's called disillusionment. And it sounds like it's a bad thing, but disillusion means the shattering of the illusion. Because the first 2 stages are not really true. The first 2 stages are an illusion. I'm creating a fantasized, idealized, romanticized version of whom I want you to be. And for a while you can sustain that. But at some stages, the persona I'm wearing in order to attract you grows thin, and my ego breaks through, and now it's met by your ego, and what started off as two personas trying to seduce each other, winds up as two egos battling with each other. The fourth stage, if we have the resources and the ability to learn and to grow through stage 3, is real love. And now it's two souls dancing, not two egos battling or two personas pretending, but two souls dancing with each other. And that's what it looks like, for instance, in romantic relationships. When you take it into the spiritual life, you get the same kind of a pattern in 5 stages. And the first stage is the awakening. You come across a great idea, you read a great book, you hear a great teacher speaking or whatever, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my God, why have I been asleep all my life? This is what it's about. You get really, really excited. That's stage 1 in the spiritual journey. Stage 2 is called the purgative way. Now you begin to kind of get rid of all the things that are distracting you from the journey, any addictions or attachments you have, and you begin to practice meditation maybe, or prayer or whatever. Stage 2, the purgative way. The third stage is called the illuminative way. Because of this new practice and this newfound creativity, you're having all these great experiences, great visionary experiences, and they're lifting you up into the 7th heaven, and it feels really, really, really good. That's stage 3. Stage 4 always comes in the spiritual journey, and it's called the dark night of the soul. As Cesar pointed out a few weeks ago, it should actually be called the dark night of the ego, because the soul doesn't have dark nights, but the ego certainly does. And stage 4 is, you're doing all the same things you were doing in stages 2 and stages 3, but it feels dull and dry and desiccated. And you wonder, what's the point in doing it? And a lot of people give up at this stage. And the object of this stage of the journey is to try to make you realize that you've been staying with the process because it really felt good to the ego. Now the ego isn't being satisfied anymore. Will you stay still committed to the relationship, even if it doesn't feel good? And this is the great test of many, many great saints. And that stage of the dark night of the soul, it could last anywhere from months to many, many years. The priest who was Mother Teresa's confessor and who wrote her biography said that for the second half of her life, Mother Teresa was in the dark night of the soul. She didn't know whether God existed or not. But she got up every morning, she meditated, she went to Mass, she prayed, she went out into the streets of Calcutta, she picked up little babies, she brought them home, she cleaned them, she fed them, she nursed them, not knowing whether God even existed. And next day she got up and did the very, very same thing. That was the dark night of the soul. That takes extraordinary soul to stay that level of committed in the dark. I told you a story many times about, from the Talmud, Jewish tradition, of 4 rabbis, each of whom independently asked if they might have an experience of heaven while they were still alive, an encounter with God while they were still alive. And God granted it. And one guy goes into heaven, and because of what happens, he dies of fright. The second guy goes into heaven, and because of what happens, he loses his mind and goes crazy. The third guy goes in, and because of what happens, he loses his faith. He becomes an atheist. And the fourth guy, Rabbi Akiba, goes in and comes out with serenity, because Rabbi Akiba was the only one who realized that even the absence of God is God. Rabbi Akiba could stay in the dark night of the soul and not be thrown by it. The other 3 couldn't. And so the dark night of the soul is part of the journey. The 5th stage in the spiritual journey is when we've shed the ego completely and we're committed to the journey, not because it feels good egoically, but because we know in the core of our soul, this is who we are and this is why we've come. And that leads to what's called the unitive stage. Many of the thrills are gone, but there's the total commitment to staying steadfast and committed to the purpose of God. So that's what community looks like in a spiritual journey. If you take it into organization, you take a typical startup. Silicon Valley in here is famous for its startups. You look at startups go through the same kind of stages. So you get some kind of charismatic individual, say, let's say Steve Wozniak and a Steve Jobs. And they have this great idea about a personal computer. And they get together in their little garage, that's stage 1, this excitement of a new possibility. And then they gather a few guys around them, and all these guys have long hair, and they're wearing jeans, and they're working 24 hours a day, and they're just loving it, building this great, great thing. And then at some stage they get successful, and somebody says, we need a real CEO here, somebody who understands business world, and we need to kind of get respectability here. And so they drag in somebody who's wearing a suit, and they put him in charge, and stage 4, it nosedives. Now, a lot of them, that's where they end up. People with some kind of sense, they bring back the Steve Jobs and they kind of resurrect the whole thing and you go forward. But startups go through the same kinds of stages. And very definitely, communities go through the same kinds of stages. Spiritual communities go through the same stages. So either you're going to encounter a community, a spiritual community, or you're going to help create one. And the excitement is palpable. And it lasts for months and months and months, maybe even a few years. You're totally excited by helping to create this new group or encountering it and becoming part of this new. It feels really, really, really great to you. And stage 2 is everybody pitches in. And everybody is volunteering for all the kinds of jobs. And everything gets handled. And everybody is loving everybody. And it's very, very easy to stay involved. Stage 2. Stage 3 always comes in a community. And this is now personality clashes. At this stage now we start projecting onto somebody else or some other group. And we project one or two things. We project, idealism onto one person and we make gods of them. Or we project our shadow stuff onto others and we demonize them. And then there's the infighting begins in the community. And a lot of communities will collapse at that stage. Now, if we have the courage as a community to kind of tough it out in just those times, then there's a breakthrough and there's a deeper level of community that emerges from it. So I want to examine that notion then for a few minutes of the disillusionment phase or the dark night of the soul phase, because it's a very, very important part of the journey. Without this, we don't really, really stretch into the future. So every group has to get to the place where you've outgrown the excitement of the initial stages and you're in it now because community is what is about you. So it's a very important part. You can't create real community in the absence of this stage of the journey. And what happens very often is that you get this community-made downsize, but that there's a stability there and there's a commitment among the members, which didn't exist initially, apart from the kind of egoic thrill of being part of something new. So every community that's going to do anything important in the world is going to have to go through a stage 3, and you survive it and do great things in the world, even in a small way, or crash and burn as a result of this stage 3. So these are typically the stages that every community will go through, whether it's Apple computers or it's the early church or it's COJ or whatever. So this is par for the course. And so not to be upset when we reach bumps in the road. The third stage then is I want to look at the history and the future of ministry. So within the kind of the typical conventional religious or thinking, a ministry is a job conferred by a hierarchy on an individual somewhere down the line. And so, for instance, a bishop up on top ordains a priest, or the priest who's up on top, appoints lectors, or communion ministers, or the parish council. So we think that a ministry is something which is conferred from somebody above in the hierarchy onto somebody in a lower position of the hierarchy. I don't believe that at all, although that's how it operates very, very typically in most of the churches. For me, ministry has 4 components. There's a need in a community. There's an individual who volunteers to address that need in the community. Then that volunteer is given the training to do the job for which she's volunteered. And then fourthly, she's commissioned by the community to act in that capacity on their behalf. So the 4 stages of any ministry, and I don't care whether it's a bishop or a priest or a lector, or a social worker, that's how it happens, really, I believe, in a real community. There's a need in the community. There's somebody who volunteers to address the need. That person is given the training to do the job and then is commissioned by the community to act in that capacity on their behalf. Now, unfortunately, none of the churches work like that. Now, when I look today's story then, for instance, in the Acts of the Apostles, let me give you the backstory to it. So from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 6, and now Jesus has ascended, gone back to the Father, and the young community is struggling to try to make its way in the world in a very, very hostile environment. And at one stage, there's a dispute arises within the group itself. So now you're at stage 3 in the community building. There's conflict arising within the group, as inevitably there will. And the conflict on this occasion is between the Hellenistic Jews and the Hebraic-speaking Jews. But the backstory is that the vast bulk of Jews at the time of Jesus lived in what's called the diaspora. They lived outside the land of Israel. They lived in Rome, and they lived in Damascus, and they lived in Alexandria. But twice a year they would come back to Jerusalem for major feasts, and they'd get caught up in the news. So when they came back at one stage, they hear about this character called Jesus. And many of them are fascinated by him. But they're not Hebrew speaking, they're Hellenists, so they're speaking Greek. The Roman Empire at the time of Jesus was Greek speaking. The western part of it spoke Latin, but the eastern part spoke Greek. And all the literati, the educated people in the Roman Empire, even though the Romans had conquered Greece, they were Greek-speak. Greek was the language of the literate and the educated people. And so these Hellenistic Jews weren't speaking Aramaic, which is what the Jews in Israel would be speaking. They were speaking Greek. So there's a conflict arising. In the daily distribution of food to those who were needy, the widows and the orphans who spoke Greek were being neglected. And the widows and the orphans who spoke Aramaic were being helped. And they objected, this is not right. Why are we being discriminated against? And so they bring this to the attention of the 12 apostles. And these guys sit down and say, well, you know what? Our job is to preach the message. It's not our job to feed people. That's social outreach. So let's create a whole new team of people, and this will be their function. So, our job, the job that Jesus gave to us was to preach good news and heal. And so, obviously, there's a new need has risen. So now there's a new need in the community, and people are volunteered. They say, you pick out people you think are suitable, and we'll commission them on your behalf. So they pick out 7 people, and they present them to the apostles, and the apostles commission them to act in that capacity. And these people are called deacons, diaconia. And the diaconia was literally the first kind of social worker, because they were looking after the social needs of the group. So over the course of the next several years, they would respond to and create 7 new ministries to address different kinds of needs in the community. 4 of them would have to do with liturgical needs, and 3 of them would have to do with social needs. And so the liturgical needs were as following. They created the notion of what was called the porter, the doorkeeper. Now you think, big deal. So some guy's going to open the door and say, you're welcome, come in. That's not what it was about. This was a persecuted movement, and they met secretly in homes. And when somebody came to the door, they were never sure, was it a Roman soldier? Was it a spy? Was it somebody who wants to join our group? So there's some guy outside looking who's coming, and he was called the porter. He was like the security guard. So there's this need, to protect the safety of the worshippers. And so the porter was a ministry created to address a need. The next one was lector, reader. At this stage, not very many people knew how to read. And so when the churches exchanged letters with each other, the church in Damascus sent a letter to the church in Jerusalem or whatever, not everybody in the church could read. So they say, anybody here read? And Deborah sticks up her and says, yeah, I learned to read. So great, you're going to be our reader. Every time we get a letter from a community, you're the guy we got to. So they create a ministry to address the need in the community. They get to create the ministry. At one stage, they create the notion of the acolyte, and the acolyte is the person who helps the presider at the Eucharist, who knows the ropes and knows the liturgy and is helping him get along. So it looked like the altar boy. At some stage, just became an altar boy. But it was an acolyte who helped the priest, and the priest then was in charge of the liturgical function. And so here were 4 ministries created to address the liturgical needs of the group. And then they created 3 groups to address the social needs. The first one we just heard about was the diaconate, and their function literally was social workers. Find out who in the community is lacking food or care of some kind, and we address that need. At some stage, this became such an important job, they created a sub-diaconate. So the sub-deacons were assistants to the social workers in that process. Maybe they kept the computer keys or the records or whatever, and they passed them on to the deacons who distributed the food or whatever. And then they created the exorcist. Now, when we think of exorcist, we think of, a guy, with a girl's head turning back to front, a guy doing kind of strange mumbo-jumbo. At the time of Jesus, all illnesses were regarded as being the result of some kind of demonic intervention. There was a very simplistic notion that whenever anybody is ill, physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually, it's because demons have gotten in the act somehow. Now, it's very simplistic. It's almost as simplistic as the modern notion, that all illnesses are created by bacteria, or all illnesses are biochemical, imbalances. So we just go from one simplistic notion of illness to another. But at the time of Jesus, the belief system was that all illnesses were created by demons of some kind. So the exorcist was a healer, a medical person, who engaged in a particular intervention to cure the illnesses. So this was a social function as well. So the early church responded constantly by looking at a need in the community, identifying volunteers, training them, and then commissioning them to act on behalf of the community in this particular capacity. Now, right up through the Middle Ages, the same thing happens. As new needs develop, new ministries need to be created. So in the Middle Ages, for instance, the great monasteries of Europe could see that, starvation was a huge issue at that stage, and education. And so it was the monks, the medieval monks, who created agriculture, or saved agriculture in medieval Europe, and spread it. And they were the ones who created the great universities. Paris and Rome, Louvain, all of that, they came from the monasteries. So they saw a need for higher education, and they saw a need for feeding the people, and also self-reliance. These monasteries were totally self-reliant. They grew their own food, they built their own buildings, they made their own food, they made their own clothes, they looked after their own health, so they were totally self-sufficient. So they taught the Europeans in the Middle Ages these three things: education, agriculture, and self-reliance. When you move on to the 18 and 1900s, new needs begin to emerge, particularly need for education just for the urban urchins, the little boys and girls who were running around half naked without any education, couldn't read or write or whatever. And a group of people volunteered to address this, mainly women. So the great teaching orders, like the Sisters of Charity or the Sisters of Mercy, began to create primary school systems and secondary school systems to address this real need. At the same time, because of illness in the community, mainly women again addressed this by creating orders of nuns who were dedicated to the healing profession. I had the privilege of, in my time in Kenya, working with two such groups of women. One was called the Sisters of Mercy, who had hospitals all over the world. And the other was a group called the Medical Missionaries of Mary, who came from Ireland, who had women doctors and women nurses and went out on safari clinics. So they're looking at a modern need, and they're addressing that modern need. So that's the essence of ministry. As I look into the future, my belief system is that we desperately need two new kinds of ministries. And I believe that these two new ministries are more important than agriculture, more important than medicine, more important than education, and more important than liturgy. And the two of them would be an ecological movement and a peace movement. That we desperately need ministers, volunteers who can address those needs. Because unless we address these two needs, planet Earth will not survive very long into the future. And so that's the kind of the evolution, the history, and the evolution of ministry there. We looked then at some guidelines for leadership. So there's a great statement in the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, who was a very famous mystic who flourished about 600 years before Christ. And Lao Tzu said famously one time in his Tao Te Ching, this little booklet, he said, "Of the truly great leader, people will say, we did it ourselves." That the essence of great leadership is to inspire a community to lead itself, to do it in such a subtle way that the person isn't kind of sticking themselves out and say, "Look at me, what a great guy am I." And so there's a Latin proverb that says, "Ars celandi artem," the art of concealing art. A truly great artist makes it look very simple, unless you try to do it yourself, replicate it yourself. So the art of concealing art, this is the true art of leadership. So some principles of leadership I think are the following. I think that except in crisis situations, the ideal leader, is invisible, and the ideal leadership is invisible, and it is decentralized. It's hard to know who's in charge of what, but things get done. In crisis times, it changes a little bit. When there's a real crisis, you need a visible leadership, and it's centralized at that stage. But that should be very, very infrequent. So for the main part, leadership should be almost invisible and decentralized, so things are just taking their own course. The next principle, I think, is the kind of a complementarity between styles of leadership again. It's crisis leadership versus ordinary leadership. And so I think that all things being equal, leadership should rotate through the community. But the complementary part of that is we should not be making changes in leadership just for the sake of making changes in leadership if the applicants or people who are volunteering for positions don't have the ability, the training, the will, or the commitment to doing the job. There's no point in just replacing a successful group with an unsuccessful group just to change the team. And so these are two complementary kinds of principles for leadership. That by and large, everybody in the community their gifts should be recognized. But not to put people into leadership positions for which they're not qualified. We have different kinds of gifts. I don't know diddly squat about finances. I'd make a terrible, Margaret Parra here, or Michael Choi. I know nothing about finances. I don't want to be involved with it whatsoever. And so to promote somebody into a position for which they're totally not qualified is bad. And so we have to realize that, while everybody should have the ability of exercising leadership skills, it must be commensurate with the need in the community and the ability of the volunteer, and then commission them for that stage. Now, I think that by and large, a truly successful organization, the leadership is seamless, and a lot of the jobs are done by people who don't have official positions. And I think that's been true of COJ by and large. A huge amount of the work that gets done in COJ is by people whose names are not appearing on, note paper as, I do, I'm in charge of it, I'm X or I'm Y. A whole bunch of stuff gets done by people who don't have these positions. And here I would really like to honor Kathleen Lyons, a founding mother of our organization, a founding mother of the Thomas Merton Centre, a founding mother of Companions on the Journey, who's done so much for our community over the years. And apart from all of the other things that she's created, including the wise women and the crones and whatever, there's one piece she does, and you're probably not even aware of it. At one stage, she was part of a spiritual community in the East Bay, and she learned from the teacher there a kind of selfless leadership, or just looking at what needed to be done and doing it. So Kathleen, wherever she went, and I have evidence of this from her, and you may not know it, every bathroom that Kathleen went into, she cleaned it up. Every single bathroom. It could be, in a disgusting condition. It could be Safeway. It could be at my office in Los Altos, whatever. Every bathroom she went into, she made a point of cleaning the place, before she left it. And nobody knew that. She confided in that me one time when we were talking about her old teacher. And so that kind of thing, you see a need, and you do it. Even a grotty job like picking up toilet paper and cleaning the bowl or whatever, or the wash hand basin or whatever, doing it because it was there. Nobody else was doing it. So that's the kind of the style of leadership, just seeing what needs to be done and then beginning to do that. So as we move as we continue to move in our community with God's help, I want to finish by talking about an extraordinary group of people whom I've mentioned before. Reading a book called The 8 Laws of Change that I've recommended a few times by a guy called Stephen Schwartz. And he pointed out in his book, he said, the 7 great socially progressive movements of the United States of America over the last 200 years have one thing in common. I'm thinking, what the hell is it going to be? And he says, abolitionism, the end of slavery, penal reform, public education, women's suffrage, civil rights, the nuclear freeze, and ecological awareness. These 7 movements have one thing in common. They were all founded by Quakers. Every single one of these at core was a little group of Quakers who started this off, and without any expectation of being recognized in any way. And so Quakers constitute, at the moment, there are, I believe, 87,000 Quakers in the United States of America out of a population of 319 million. There are something like 269,000 Quakers worldwide out of a population of 7 billion. But this little group of dedicated people, very, very, very quietly, have created all of these extraordinary social changes. In fact, in 1947, the Quakers of England were given the Nobel Peace Prize for work that they did during the war. And they don't believe in war at all, so they did not get involved in any way in the fighting, but they had what they call bomb squads. So when there were unexploded bombs in the cities in England, these guys would go out in their trucks and pick them up and take them away to someplace so they could be safely detonated. And a whole bunch of them got killed because these bombs exploded in transit. So they were given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947. And when they wanted somebody to go to Stockholm to pick it up and make a speech, nobody would volunteer. Nobody would stick and say, I was the guy who had the idea firstly. Nobody would do it. So the Peace Prize was conferred in absentia on the Quaker movement in England in 1947. So the notion that, you're not doing something in order to be noticed, even to be acknowledged, but because it needs to be done. Somebody needs to pick up the toilet paper, and Kathleen Lyons does it. So these principles, there are simple principles that allow any community to laserize its effectiveness in the world. And at some stage, I'd love us just to look at that book and think about how we might incorporate that into our decision-making process at COJ. But Margaret Mead, the very famous anthropologist, said one time, do not doubt that a small group of people, with focused, laser-eyed intentionality can affect a change in the entire world. She said, in fact, nothing else ever has except that. And so here's my plea to this little group. We're a small little group. We've survived our own forms of vicissitude. We've gone through our own stages of growth and disillusion, whatever, and we're a stable, loving community looking out for each other. And so to continue with our journey, realizing that we may be a single neuron on the brain of planet Earth right now. And all we need to do is to be as effective as we can to connect up with other people, and finally, by banding together our intentionality and our love, move the planet itself toward Christ consciousness.